reward network during spiritual euphoria, and you have been studying communication among brain regions during various kinds of spiritual experiences. Um, Michael's taught several courses at Harvard, including Neurospirituality, Virtue Science, and Cognitive Neuroscience of Meditation. I think I'd like to listen in on some of those lectures if it were possible. And currently teaches mindful self-compassion courses online. And today you'll be talking about the neuroscience of spirituality. So Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you so much again for the opportunity to be here and to share some of my work and to hear your perspectives on these topics. Let's go into the slideshow mode here. So particularly, we're going to be talking about the intersection of spirituality and meditation through the lenses of human neuroscience. As was mentioned, I direct neurospirituality research in the Neurospirituality Lab, and I'm an instructor at Harvard Medical School. I want to talk briefly about some methods and see if we can at least illuminate the matter a bit without getting too bogged down into the weeds. That said, I do want everyone to feel encouraged to ask questions about anything that they're curious about. And we'll approach it with the interdisciplinary virtues of curiosity and humility and generosity. And don't worry, if it draws out a little too long, I reserve the right to say, like, that's a really good topic, but let's go further into the data. Background on methods here is that we can think about brain imaging in two broad categories of anatomical studies and functional studies. Anatomical studies are interested in things like gray matter volume or the white matter tracks between gray matter regions, or lesion studies, an area where you've got focal brain damage, and then you have an associated symptom or behavior change. Functional studies are largely, certainly they're not exclusively, but they're largely represented by functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, when we're in this space of meditation and spirituality. Within the sub-breakdowns of fMRI research, you can have task-based studies, and those are ones where someone goes into a scanner, they do an active task, like a guided loving-kindness meditation, and then it's assessed what's happening in their brain specifically during that task. So in this case, again, during the loving kindness meditation versus during a default resting state. You can also do resting state fMRI, which the individual is in the scanner, they're just allowing their mind to wander. And so it's examining intrinsic correlations in spontaneous neural activity. Often you'll hear referred to the human connectome. And the human connectome is this map of the functional correlations during resting state. And it was first done in healthy control adults, but now there are lots of different specialty connectomes as well. So like, what is the resting state profile like in the context of depression? Or what is it like in autism or Alzheimer's, et cetera? So my early work for neurospirituality was largely in the category of task-based fMRI, where we put people in the scanner. Since I was at the University of Utah, the dominant religious population were Latter-day Saints, sometimes known as Mormons. So this study was designed around having, devoted Mormons come into the laboratory, go into the scanner, and then perform religious tasks, such as reading the Book of Mormon, which is sacred scripture in the religious context, or praying. Then it's part of the Mormon cultural tradition to report in real time when you're feeling the spirit, when you're having a peak moment of like religious insight or ecstasy. But it's more affective rather than cognitive in nature. And we were able to see that across all of our participants, when they were indicating to us that they were feeling the spirit, that there was reliable elevation of activity in a series of regions, including the nucleus accumbens, which is one of the reward regions of the brain. So for me, though, some of the real take-home messages from this first study were, first of all, that people are reliable self-reporters of a spiritual experience. A lot of times, self-report generally gets called into question for its reliability, and much more so when we're talking about something as complex as spirituality. A second major take-home for me was that people can indeed have spiritual experiences in a brain scanner. And that was huge, just to see as a prototype that this is a viable direction for me to pursue. Another take home is a little bit philosophical in nature, but it's whatever is ultimately happening, whatever your metaphysics or ontology look like, whatever is ultimately happening, these participants are not merely confabulating. So something real is going on, whether that's psychogenic, neurogenic, theogenic. It's not simply a story without some kind of grounding and experiential phenomena. If you're interested in this line of study, you're welcome to go check out my TEDx talk, This is Your Brain on God, which dives into more details about this study with some surprising twists and turns to tease it a little bit. Since 2017, my work has centered on co-developing and applying a set of methods that have come to be known as lesion network mapping. I mentioned before lesion studies, where we can look at a specific location in the brain that has been damaged. We can then look at new onset behaviors or changes in behavior and make an association between that area of the brain that was damaged and the changes in the observed behavior. The development here, there's a whole side tangent about the ancient history of lesion mapping, but anyways, maybe in the discussion we can get to that. But the development here is that with the human connectome, we can now look at a lesion location and then infer the distributed connections that are associated with that lesion. That's why we're able to do lesion network mapping. So looking system-wide at what functions have been compromised by a focal lesion. And this was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. Mike Fox is the PI and the center director where these techniques have been developed. So I want to pause here and open it up for questions or for discussion on some of the methods background before we dive into the applications and the topics.
Just a quick question, Michael. When you're trying to map the associated networks to a lesion, you're using DTI anatomical data, right? Or are you using functional correlations or functional connectivity data?
Yep, great question. So for these studies, I am using functional connectivity data, but I mean, you anticipate where I want to go with these is into like apply structural mapping results and to have multimodal analysis of some of these different psychometrics.
Thanks. Any other questions from anyone? Okay, why don't you continue then, Michael?
Great. So when we were starting with lesion network mapping as a method, we wanted to look at something where we knew where it ought to map. And so we started with amnesia because we have really strong priors about where episodic memory ought to map. And lo and behold, indeed, as we developed these methods, we were able to show the strongest functional correlations in the hippocampus, and even more specifically in the subiculum of the hippocampus. So again, nothing, groundbreaking here that memory localizes to the hippocampus. This was to say, like, yes, the method produces something that we can interpret sensibly. So now that we have validated methods that we trust, we turn again to spirituality. In the first study that I conducted using lesion network mapping for spirituality, I had two independent data sets. Data set one was a sample of neurosurgical patients. So the brain lesions for these individuals were from neurosurgical resection. It was precise, it was with the surgeon's scalpel. The psychometric data that we had corresponding to these neurosurgical lesions was a construct termed spiritual acceptance. And spiritual acceptance quantifies the impact of spiritual and religious experience on core beliefs. The second data set had 105 individuals, and these were war veterans from Vietnam who had penetrating head trauma. The self-report measure here was simply, are you religious, yes or no? So what this sets us up to do is to identify across two independent data sets functional correlations with brain lesions that are associated with these spiritual and religious self-report measures. So looking at just a very broad category level here, what we saw is that the spiritual and religious brain lesions had strongest correlations in the periaqueductal gray, which is a brainstem region, and has a lot of interesting associations that we'll look at more closely here in a minute. To give you a focus view of the anatomical location, this is where the periaqueductal gray, the PAG, is located. It surrounds the aqueduct there, where cerebrospinal fluid passes through. And then the PAG itself also it has a columnar structure. So there are anatomical subdivisions, and previous work that's looked at the white matter mapping for those anatomical subdivisions showed differential targets depending on the zone of the PAG that you're looking at. All right, so back to our study. What you see in the cool and the warm colors in the large brain figures are the directions of functional association relative to the PAG. So on the bottom right there is our reference zone in the PAG. And if an area is cool colored in the brain, it means that it has the opposite functional signature relative to the PAG, that if the PAG goes up, we would expect these regions to go down in the relative activity. What we saw is that when we searched the literature for hyper religiosity, so lesions where there was new onset behavior, such as joining 3 religious movements in a set of weeks. In each of those 4 cases of lesion-related new onset hyperreligiosity, the lesion location was in the zones that have a negative functional association relative to our hypothesized localization for spiritual religiosity in the PAG. Thinking of the brain as a whole system, we think of the cool color regions or the inversely associated functional regions as kind of like the cooling system for the reference zone. So you can think of these regions as like areas where when they have more activity, you would expect the PAG to decrease its activity overall. And then vice versa. In the red zones here on those big brain slices, the red and the yellow zones, when activity increases there, it statistically is associated with increased activity in the PAG and that reference zone at the bottom right. Okay, so once again, the point here is that in each of these 4 cases that we mined from the literature, where there was a lesion, we could locate it. It was like it was, breaking the cooling system, so to speak. And so if the cooling system goes out, the circuit overheats.
Can I ask one question? I don't read a lot about what EAG is supposed to be doing, but the things that I have read have more to do with the experience of pain. Is there any relationship, or are you going to be talking about that later? Or
No, that's a really great point, and I'm glad that you brought that up because pain and fear conditioning are 2 of the things that people associate it with most widely, and I will be bringing that up. That has a couple of different dimensions of relevance. So thank you for that, Mark.
Sure, go ahead.
Alrighty. So going the opposite direction here, seizures you can think of it as the opposite of a lesion. When you have a lesion, boom, activity disappears. When there's a seizure, whoop, it's driving hyperactivity of a region. It's established that seizures where the seizure onset zone is in the hippocampus have a higher likelihood of a hyper-religious dimension to the seizure than seizures where the onset zone is in the amygdala. And so this is convergent with what we see in the functional connectivity relative to the PAG, again, our reference zone there in the bottom right, that the PAG has a positive functional association with the hippocampus, but a negative functional association with the amygdala. So it converges with this, theoretical frame that we're developing for PAG having a contributory role to spiritual religiosity. And then lastly, for now, we looked across our library at our center for brain lesions that were associated with clinical symptoms of interest. That allows us to then look at the spatial location of these symptom-associated lesions and see if there are any greater than chance spatial similarities to our spiritual religious brain circuit here. And we saw that the highest degree of similarity was with spatial locations for lesions that are associated with delusions. And this is usually the slide where people who have been skeptical about spirituality and religion mapping look at this and they say, oh, okay, yeah, I believe the methods now. Religious spirituality is similar to delusions in the brain. So hopefully we've opened some windows of credibility with this result. What this means is that we would predict based on these results that intense increases in spirituality and religiosity would correlate with an increased likelihood of delusional thought. And so I'm curious, especially in a crowd where there are scholar practitioners and experienced practitioners, I'm curious for thoughts about implications for intense or accelerated spirituality and religiosity protocols, such as retreats or psychedelics, deep practice, group rituals, festivals, periods of religious conversion, neuromodulation, or consciousness hacking broadly. All right, so back to Mark's question about what are other functions where the PAG is implicated. Mark had brought up pain inhibition. I mentioned also fear conditioning. I'll note, though, that a lot of these canonical functions are established using non-human animal models. And so in humans, the PAG has been associated in some pretty high level, or at least what we would often typify as high level functions, such as compassion and then also maternal love. So with compassion, what I'm showing you here are the results from a meta-analysis of 16 independent task fMRI compassion studies. So most of these were where people were doing loving kindness meditation or compassion meditation in the scanner. And the largest region that was consistently activated included the periaqueductal gray. Then there's a forthcoming case report where there was a brain lesion that occurred directly and exclusively on the PAG. The chief complaint of the patient was that she was no longer able to feel love for her children. And so it was, Tibetan Buddhism was mentioned earlier. And I'm like a learner in all of these interdisciplinary aspects of neurospirituality. But what I understand about Tibetan Buddhism is that these ideas are quite tightly nested into the core of that path. Okay, so pause here for reflections and for questions. I'm curious, what connections are you making with your own work, your own practice, and what you're seeing here?
Well, when Mark mentioned PAG and pain, that resonated with me because I wrote an article, which I'll send you, that's published now in the Psychology of Consciousness journal about mental pain. And a lot of the of things that we do that regulate mental pain involve downregulation, neural downregulation to the PAG. And it seems like the PAG is a very important interoceptive relay station. And so the role of interoception is very important in meditation. Turns out that there's some article that shows that, part of the good results of meditation are mediated by an increased attention and accuracy towards interoception, to actually processing your bodily feelings. So that's a connection I see there.
Thank you for that, Barry.
If I can follow up with a bit of a technical question, you've mentioned that the PAG has a columnar structure and there are subnuclei. Are you able to assign any of these functions to specific subregions of PAG? That, seems to have lots of jobs and probably not all of it. Well, maybe all of it's involved in every job, but perhaps not.
Yep. No, great question. There's a really good review that I can send out. If you have an email list that could be a follow-up, I'll send you this review where it does have some theoretical associations with different columnar regions within the PAG.
Yeah, if you could send that to me or to Sai, that would be just fine, or Barry.
You bet.
We
Yeah,
we
but
do have a list of everyone who is registered for the series, so that, I mean, we can send information out to participants also if it's a
great.
possible.
That would be great. I'll send that over to you.
Um,
And I'll
yeah.
just throw one thing on this topic, though, of this particular meta-analysis that was very thorough. They come up with some hypotheses for big picture organizational features of the PAG, for big picture functional organization. And their punchline is that the PAG is involved in appetitive and aversive motivations. So if that's the case, like, I can't help myself from imagining ways in which really, really basic functions of appetitive and aversive meditation then potentially become culturally elaborated, socially embedded, and then we have this wide-ranging heritage of heaven and hell stories, or the analogs of like, oh, here is now the ultimate in terms of what is desired, and here's the ultimate of what is to be avoided. So lots of fun ways that you could start exploring hypotheses that spin out of this localization.
I had a question. So what you were showing so far was mostly uh, sort of inferences from functional MRI data. And so I was wondering, have you tried to look into further correlations with more broader bodily functions, or scans that are,
Mm.
more whole body beyond the brain, and are there connections and effects that kind of span through, that are that have this sort of correlation to their sort of meditative experience?
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding correctly, trying to get down into that question of interoceptive awareness and the degree to which that is co-functional with whatever's happening with spiritual religiosity. No, that's nice. If you have one thing that I can do, especially if there is a meta-analysis that's been published, and I'm sure that there is, I just don't have expertise on this particular vein in literature. But extracting XYZ coordinates that are reported in a meta-analysis for interoceptive awareness, and then looking at the degree of statistical correlation between this map here that we're looking at. So
Mm-hmm.
no, these are doable analyses.
When you mentioned that there was an overlap between brain regions involved in hyperreligiosity and brain regions involved involved in delusions, what statistically significant, but I don't recall, did you say sort of what degree of overlap? Are we talking 30%, which could be quite statistically significant if we're talking about sparse areas? Or are we talking 70%?
Yeah, so this metric was what looks at the damage to the networks. And so it's quantifying the degree to which a lesion was hitting our spirituality network. But what you're asking about for a spatial correlation is also, that's very computable. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the spatial correlation is between those. But this is one of the things that I love about this type of conversation, is that it's like, oh yeah, I should look at that too. So
I'll
very
follow
much,
up with email.
yeah, please do.
Great, thanks. Please go on. Yeah.
These are terrific questions. Some of the recent work that I've had published was looking at religious fundamentalism. So now, again, with that first study, it was really this domain general spiritual religiosity. So now I want to go into particular aspects of spirituality and religiosity. And this study was looking at religious fundamentalism. This is to give you kind of the unfiltered flavor of what it is that we're tapping into with this construct of religious fundamentalism. So the items that are color coded in red here positively contribute to your religious fundamentalism score. The items color coded in blue, if you agree with them, then they take away from your overall religious fundamentalism score. So 2 disclaimers that I really, really, really want to drive home here. The first disclaimer is that there is nothing wrong with being inclined toward religious fundamentalism. Like, people kind of get a little bit like, you know, defensive or nervous here, where it's like, okay, where is this going? So there's nothing wrong with being oriented toward religious fundamentalism. That's number one. Number two is that simply agreeing with some of these items or agreeing with all these items, you know, to a more or less extent, does not mean like, oh no, I now am a religious fundamentalist. No, like everybody is on this distribution for a religious fundamentalism score. And so to be on the upper end of that distribution, you'd have to strongly agree with all of these in the direction relative to religious fundamentalism. All right, no need to be nervous, even though these are can be very nerve-inducing topics. Here was our banner result. We looked across 190 individuals who, in this case, had the same religious fundamentalism scale that had been administered to them. We observed that using the most conservative statistical thresholding for brain imaging statistics of this type, we had significant associations in the right frontoparietal temporal regions that are indicated here, as well as there was some midline orbital frontal participation in the network. But again, just to me, the fact that we get this association with this degree of statistical strength is really standout. I'll note that this pattern was independent of the sub-Christian cultural context. So both Protestant and Catholic identifying individuals had the same pattern association with religious fundamentalism. We, in this study, only had a Christian dominant population, but I would love to perform this type of work in more religiously diverse populations. When I conducted that same analysis of taking our religion circuit, in this case, our religious fundamentalism circuit, and comparing it to the spatial location of brain lesions associated with diverse symptoms and behaviors. For the religious fundamentalism circuit, the strongest spatial similarities were with lesions associated with confabulation and with criminal behavior. And confabulation is sometimes referred to as honest lying, because the person will have a very well-constructed narrative. It's just that that well-constructed narrative is objectively falsified and falsifiable. So for example, a patient in a hospital room with their doctor, and the doctor asks them, how's it going? And the patient says, it's great. I'm really winning at blackjack right now, you know, thinking, or not, but just like reporting that they're in a casino. With criminal behavior, this is violent and aggressive criminal behavior. So things like rape and murder. So the questions that emerge here include, what are pathways between these different observed behaviors? And this is well established in political history, social history, religious history, that there is a dimension in which religious fundamentalism has been associated with violent behaviors. So again, perhaps these findings could shed some new light or craft some new hypotheses to speak to some associations that have been challenging humanity for as long as humanity has been humanity. Okay, so now current work is work to look at neural signatures for mystical experiences.
Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a thought. I mean, previously you had a slide on like with with delusional thoughts. So
Yep.
is there, correlation between like regions associated with delusional thought and fundamentalism?
No, so it's a good question here. Delusions in this sample had an inverted spatial set of locations relative to the functional pattern. This is one of the areas where it's like, oh, I with delusion and hallucination in particular, I think it's really important to drill down into subtypes, because, for example, I will not be surprised if something like, you know, religious delusion or grandiose delusion have a different set of associations with these circuits than, you know, any number of other delusions. And then similarly with hallucination, I mean, almost guaranteed that the sensory components and contributions for religious hallucination or for hallucination would vary on whether it was a visual hallucination, an auditory hallucination. And then it's an ongoing point of research and debate about whether all hallucinations share some underlying structure. So zooming back to answer your question, at this, you know, first level of analysis, the signal is not strongest for an association between delusion and this religious circuit. But as we subcategorize delusion, we might see that there are some specified types of delusions that have stronger correlations.
Yeah, I mean, it seems surprising to me that confabulation goes in such an opposite direction to delusion. I thought there was a relationship between delusion and confabulation.
Yes, there is. And so this, we have a paper just looking at confabulation and lesion network mapping, and we do show the similarities between confabulation and delusion. This here is just saying that relative to the fundamentalism network, that confabulation and delusion break in different ways relative to that network. So they still have an association with each other. It's just they're splitting the difference on how they line up with fundamentalism. So not identical, but they share variation.
Yeah, actually, I guess it would be interesting to know the more specific definition of confabulation and the definition of delusion. I mean, because I'm confabulating them together or something. But we can talk about that later.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so just that in general with delusion, like strongly fixed belief versus confabulation, I think more of, you know, just like the ad hoc narration with unexamined belief monitoring, unexamined reality monitoring. For sure. These are like exactly the types of questions that I think we need to parse out more clearly. So it's all welcome. Alrighty, so with mystical experiences, for this study, I'm using an abbreviated form of the Hood mysticism scale. And I'll let you take a few moments here to read through some of the items, because here, I mean, by definition, mystical experience start to go into the realm of the ineffable, things that don't easily fit into typical language. So take another moment to try to get an intuitive sense of what it is that we're trying to tap into with this construct. Okay. Mysticism is also associated with psychological measures for transpersonal identification. Transpersonal identification is a feeling of being deeply connected to something bigger than yourself, like nature, other people, or God. Mystical experiences are positively associated with transpersonal identification, and this was first reported by Robert Cloninger in his 94 paper on the temperament and character inventory, and then it's been widely replicated and demonstrated over and over again. So we're going to study here whether there are mystical experience and transpersonal identification co-localizations in the brain. And again, in these two independent data sets, one we have scores for mysticism, and one we have scores for transpersonal identification. And that sets us up to look at whether they share functional neuroanatomy with each other. One way of looking at that is to identify the whole brain statistical map for lesion connections of each of these constructs, and then do sort of a cross-test approach where you put the lesion locations from one data set on top of the map that was defined by the opposite data set. And you see whether the location relative to the opposite map is still associated with your construct of interest. And in this case, it is that transpersonal identification and mysticism have positive cross-test validity here. In preliminary analyses, the mysticism network is also associated with lesion locations for conscious awareness, in the sense that coma-causing lesions have the opposite signature or the opposite location pattern relative to our mysticism network. Cooperativeness has a positive association with the mysticism network. These were surgical brain lesions, so we have longitudinal personality measures. And in brain regions where there was a post-surgical increase in cooperativeness, that you had the lesion location aligning in directions associated with higher likelihoods for mystical experiences. The mysticism network is also associated with lesion locations for an interesting clinical symptom that's called blind sight. Blind sight is a condition where a patient reports no visual sensory perception. In the clinical setting, though, the physician will ask the patient questions that rely on some kind of visual data from their room. So, for example, the clinician will be tracing a shape on the wall with a laser pointer, and they'll have the patient face it, and they'll ask the patient, what shape am I tracing? And the patient resists because, they'll insist that they don't have any visual perception. But, when the clinician really draws it out of them, they'll say a star. And, so they'll get this correct. So there's, apparently veridical information that is bypassing conscious awareness, but that is still getting processed and formulated into expressive concepts, which is crazy when you start thinking about the ways that may, inform or shed light onto how we could think about the cognitive processes for what becomes labeled as mysticism. We saw inverse spatial correlations for the mysticism network with lesions related to confabulating, and also inverse associations with our religious fundamentalism network. And I'll just, briefly point to two reasons why I think this is really cool and why I find it provocative. In so much of meditative practice and transcendental practice and mindfulness and even loving kindness meditation, where you use phrases, but the goal is to over time reduce the phrases or wean yourself off of the phrases into an affective quiet, you have this letting go of narrative, or this moving beyond narrative. And so if the salient neuroanatomical features that are shared between confabulation and the inverse of the mysticism network are related to cognitive processes for narration, that would be nice dovetailing with the instruction, the practice of meditation that leads to mysticism. And then with religious fundamentalism, historically, this is well observed that global religious traditions fractionate into sects that express more dogmatic beliefs and sects that express more mystical relationships with the tradition. And what we're seeing here is that neurophysiologically, we would anticipate competition between networks that respectively mediate fundamentalism or mysticism. And so, again, it makes me curious about whether there's some kind of contribution just from the individual level of functional competition in the brain that is scaled at some of these historical motifs. Just a thought. Okay. Maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this pause, but we will have time for discussion and questions at the end. Some of the current translational directions I'm going are to look at mindful self-compassion. I am certified in teaching mindful self-compassion. I've taught, I'm just finishing my third full course. It's especially interesting to me that we saw an inverse association of Parkinsonism with compassion and spirituality. What that indicates is that we would expect for behavioral stimulation of compassionate and spiritual responses to be activating networks that would decrease Parkinson's symptoms. So whether that's through, dopaminergic motor pathways, motivation pathways, who knows, but just like going straight to the neuroanatomy, we would expect compassion, spiritual stimulation to have an effect that perhaps could decrease the severity of Parkinson's symptoms. So we're exploring that by integrating the Mindful Self-Compassion 8-week course into a pilot study for Parkinson's patients. And then we'll be looking at different dimensions of Parkinson's symptoms longitudinally in association with the Mindful Self-Compassion course. Also, I'm exploring ways that mindful self-compassion could be integrated in neuromodulation therapies, especially for TMS and for DBS. One of my colleagues who is doing work on spirituality and depression is finding some important directional relationships. Like in a nutshell, it's not necessarily the case that you would expect spirituality to decrease depression if you can intervene and increase spirituality, but you would expect that spirituality could help to promote resilience against depression if you can address the depression. So the thought here being, okay, if there are ways, for example, with depression, that you could treat the symptoms using neuromodulation and then contribute to resilience and maintenance through something like mindful self-compassion, that sounds feasible and testable. With this said, I'm also very open to diversifying spiritual practices in our research agenda that we aspire to translate into clinical hypotheses. If you're interested, you can check out the intros to spirituality, here defined as meditative and prayer practices, that I have coming soon on my website. Each of the meditative and prayer practices that will be on my website have associated peer-reviewed publications that I'll share, and then have a little bit of a digest of the scientific findings and how those can help us think about the practices on offer. And then lastly, if you're interested in engaging more with these topics, hearing from other researchers working in this area, or being part of community that's starting to gather around neurospirituality, you're welcome to participate either remotely or in person in the Charter Neurospirituality Symposium. For a limited time, there's free registration. So you're welcome to take advantage of that through December 1st at neurospirituality.io. And like I said, we'll have live streaming as well as in-person components to this hybrid event. Alrighty, and with that now, I'll open it up for discussion and for final reflections.